Meet Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose life in a quiet Minnesota town during the early 1970s seemed picture-perfect until a single note hidden inside a family Bible shattered everything she thought she knew. At only 30 years old, she faced betrayal, danger, and the collapse of her marriage, but instead of breaking, Eleanor discovered an inner strength that allowed her to rebuild her world, protect her children, and transform her craft as a seamstress into a lasting legacy. Her journey is not only about personal survival, but also about the resilience, dignity, and courage that so many older adults embody when life takes unexpected turns. This is the heart of Grandma's Final Chapter, a channel dedicated to telling powerful, emotional stories about seniors who refuse to be forgotten. We believe aging is not about fading away, but about reclaiming independence, rediscovering joy, and leaving behind wisdom for future generations. If this story touches your heart, don't just watch, be part of our community. Like this video, subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter, and share where you are watching from in the comments. Every interaction helps us bring more meaningful stories to you each day, inspiring older adults everywhere to live happier, more self-reliant lives. The autumn light that filtered through the lace curtains of our living room in 1971 was soft and golden, the kind of light that made even dust motes look like diamonds in the air. Our small town by the lake in Minnesota had a rhythm of its own. Neighbors nodded politely at one another on Main Street, the church bell chimed on Sunday mornings, and the grocery store clerk knew the name of every child who came in for penny candy. To the outside world, my life was simple and enviable. I was 30 years old, married to Richard Hayes, the respected deputy manager at the town bank. We had 2 children, Daniel and Claire, who filled our modest home with chatter and laughter. People saw us as the picture of a good American family, but behind closed doors there was a silence that pressed on me like a weight. Richard had his routines, his briefcases, his business trips every first Thursday of the month. I had my sewing machine, the smell of fresh bread in the oven, the endless cycle of laundry and dishes. There were moments when I sensed a distance, something hidden just out of reach, but I told myself it was only my imagination. Wives in our town were not supposed to question, we were supposed to smile and be grateful. That Sunday in late October, a migraine pressed so sharply against my temples that I could hardly stand. Richard was away, claiming he had to review important documents at the bank. The children were at their grandmother's house for Sunday lunch. Alone in the house, desperate for relief, I searched his office for the strong pills he kept in a desk drawer. His office was a room I rarely entered. He insisted a man needed a private space, a place for concentration, and I had respected that boundary for years. I opened the drawer and rummaged through papers and pens until a wave of dizziness struck me. To steady myself, I leaned against the bookshelf. Several books shifted, and one heavy leather-bound volume slid out and fell with a dull thud onto the carpet. It was the family Bible, the one Richard polished for display but never seemed to open. The fall forced its yellowed pages apart, and from between them a folded slip of paper slid onto the floor. I bent down, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. My first thought was to put it back, to pretend I had never touched it. Richard would be furious if he discovered me meddling in his things. But curiosity and something deeper, an instinct I could not yet name, made me unfold the paper. The handwriting was not Richard's. It belonged to Edward, his superior at the bank, whose Christmas cards I had seen year after year. The words were brief, jagged, and terrifying. If she discovers the truth, remove her. For a moment, the room tilted. The pain in my head vanished, replaced by a cold rush through my veins. I sat down heavily in Richard's leather chair, clutching the paper as if it were a live coal. Who was she? Did the words mean me? What truth was so dangerous it required my elimination? Every heartbeat echoed like a hammer. The clock ticked too loudly on the wall. Outside, the lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, as if nothing had changed, but inside me, the ground had split open. In 10 years of marriage, I had endured his silences, his sudden trips, his refusal to answer questions, yet I had still believed I was safe. Now, safety itself seemed like a childish illusion. Slowly, with care, I refolded the paper and slipped it back between the brittle pages of Proverbs. I returned the Bible to the shelf exactly as it had been. I found the painkillers, swallowed one with a glass of water, and lay down on the sofa in the living room. From the outside, anyone looking in would have seen an ordinary wife resting on a Sunday afternoon. Inside me, however, 1,000 questions collided like shards of glass. When Richard returned with the children that evening, I had already decided I would not confront him. A man who could be tied to such a note was a man capable of more than betrayal. If I asked questions, I might never live to hear the answers. Instead, I would watch. I would listen. I would pretend. And in the spaces between routine, I would search for the truth myself. That night, as I served dinner and listened to Daniel talk about his grandmother's apple pie, as I nodded to Richard's jokes and poured him another cup of coffee, something inside me shifted. I was no longer the unquestioning wife who obeyed without doubt. I was a woman holding a secret, a woman marked by a threat. My smile may have looked the same, but behind it a resolve was hardening. Looking back, I know that moment was the true beginning. A folded note hidden in a Bible became the seed of everything that followed, the unraveling of lies, the collapse of illusions, and the awakening of a strength I had not known I carried. And now, my dear listeners, I want to ask you something from my heart. Have you ever experienced a moment when one small accident, one unexpected discovery, changed your life forever? If you have, share it in the comments below. I would love to hear how you faced it and what you learned, because your story may help someone else find courage too. To our neighbors in the lakeside town of Maplewood, the Hayes family was flawless. Richard Hayes walked down Main Street in polished shoes and tailored suits, his hair combed neatly back, his handshake firm, his smile practiced but reassuring. As the deputy manager of the local bank, he represented trust. Farmers shook his hand with gratitude when loans were approved, shopkeepers greeted him with respect, and even the pastor at church often mentioned Richard as a model of discipline and responsibility. I was part of that portrait as well. I had grown into the role of the perfect wife, not because I was flawless, but because I had learned that people in small towns thrive on appearances. My mornings began before sunrise. I would knead bread, the yeasty smell drifting through the kitchen, while preparing oatmeal for Daniel and buttering toast for Claire. After breakfast, I walked the children to school, nodding to neighbors who complimented me on how polite my son was or how pretty my daughter's braids looked. Then I returned home to sweep floors, wash linens, and stitch dresses for clients who admired the fine details of my needlework. Sewing had been my mother's gift to me. She used to say, "A woman who can sew will never starve." She could not have known how prophetic those words would become. Clients from nearby towns traveled to Maplewood for my work. A wedding dress here, an evening gown there, always with the careful stitches that gave me pride even when no one else noticed. To Richard, though, it was simply a hobby, something to keep me busy while he handled the real business of money. Our children were the light of my days. Daniel, 9 years old, had an insatiable love of books. He would curl up in the corner of the living room with a library copy of Treasure Island or Robinson Crusoe, his lips moving silently as he sailed through imaginary seas. Claire, 7 years old, saw the world in colors. She drew on any scrap of paper she could find, sketching houses, flowers, even faces that startled me with their accuracy. Sometimes I caught her drawing me at the sewing machine, the lines rough but unmistakable. I saved those drawings in a box, a reminder that even in a life built on routine, creativity bloomed. From the outside, our life was enviable. Richard brought roses on my birthday, chocolates on Valentine's Day, and gifts for the children at Christmas. He was affectionate in public, quick to pull me close at church picnics or kiss me on the cheek in front of neighbors. The pantry was never empty. The house, though modest, always looked tidy and well cared for. People whispered that I was fortunate, that I had married a man who worked hard, provided for his family, and never let his wife worry about bills. Yet the cracks were always there if one looked closely. Conversations between Richard and me often ended in silence. His eyes drifted elsewhere when I asked about his long hours. There were trips, always on the first Thursday of the month, explained as transfers or bank duties, that only he could manage. He would pack carefully pressed shirts, his expensive cologne, and vanish for 2 days. When he returned, he smelled of tobacco and city air, not of the paper stacks and ledgers he claimed to be buried in. I told myself I was imagining things, that every marriage had its secrets. Still, unease settled in my chest each time Thursday came around. It was not simply the absence. It was the way he refused to explain, the way his voice chilled when I asked too many questions. One evening, after the children were asleep and I was darning socks by the fire, I gathered the courage to ask. Richard sat in his armchair, the evening paper spread wide, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "Richard," I began softly, "why is it that these transfers always happen on the first Thursday? Couldn't someone else handle them once in a while?" He lowered the newspaper, his eyes narrowing slightly, though his voice remained calm. "The bank depends on me. These are important responsibilities." "But every month?" I pressed, my fingers twisting the fabric in my lap. "It feels strange, always the same day. I just want to understand." His face hardened. The warmth drained from his eyes and a cold edge entered his voice. "You have a roof over your head. You have food on the table. That is all you need to know. Do not ask again." The words fell heavy, like stones in water, pulling me into silence. I looked at him, the man I had married at 20, the father of my children, and saw not a partner, but a wall. He returned to his newspaper, the matter closed, while I sat with a knot in my stomach. That night, I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing beside me. To anyone in Maplewood, we were the Hayes family, blessed and admired. To me, lying in the dark with unanswered questions echoing in my mind, we were a family built on fragile illusions. And yet, I played my part. The next morning, I braided Claire's hair, helped Daniel tie his shoelaces, and kissed Richard on the cheek as he left for work. To the world I smiled. Inside, however, a seed of doubt was growing. The note in the Bible had already unsettled me, but his cold reply sealed something deeper. This was not only about absence, it was about control, about secrets he would protect at any cost. In the eyes of others, our family was perfect. In my heart, I knew perfection was a mask. And once a mask begins to crack, it is only a matter of time before the truth pushes through. If you have ever lived behind a mask, smiling for the world while hiding doubts in your heart, share your thoughts below. Someone who reads your words may find the courage to face their own truth. It was a late afternoon in September when the first undeniable clue slipped into my hands. I was ironing one of Richard's shirts, humming softly to keep the silence from swallowing me, when my fingers brushed against something stiff inside the pocket of his jacket. At first, I thought it was a forgotten grocery list or a crumpled receipt from the hardware store. When I pulled it out and unfolded it, my breath caught. The paper was from a jewelry store in Milwaukee, nearly 4 hours away. The elegant lettering described an item: one engagement ring with a solitaire diamond. The cost printed at the bottom made my head swim. It was nearly 3 times the money Richard gave me each month for the household. I stared at the figures, the numbers dancing in my vision, the iron cooling in my hand. For a moment, I tried to believe it was for me, perhaps a surprise gift for our upcoming anniversary. But reality, sharp and cold, pressed in. Richard had never been extravagant with me. My wedding band was a thin gold circle, nothing more. The only jewelry I owned beyond that was a brooch from my grandmother and a pair of costume earrings. An engagement ring of that price could only mean something else. Inside the same pocket, folded twice, was a small slip of paper, an address, written in Richard's unmistakable hand. I stared at the scrawl, committing it to memory, before carefully placing both items back where I had found them. My hands trembled as I finished ironing, but my mind burned with clarity. There was another life hidden in those folds of paper. For days, the address haunted me. I told myself it could be anything: a client's home, a property the bank was handling, even a friend in need. But the truth was already whispering, waiting for me to listen. I knew I had to see it with my own eyes. The following week, I created an excuse. I told Richard I needed special fabrics for a client's dress. I arranged for the children to spend the afternoon at a neighbor's house. Then I boarded the early morning bus to Milwaukee, the address heavy in my mind. The city felt enormous compared to Maplewood. I walked its busy streets with the folded note clutched tightly in my purse, my steps slowing as I neared the address. The house was a graceful two-story structure with pale siding and a flower bed neatly tended in the front. It stood in a neighborhood far finer than our modest home by the lake. I lingered by the sidewalk, uncertain, until a woman watering her roses in the yard next door greeted me with a smile. "Lovely day, isn't it?" she said warmly. I nodded, forcing a polite expression. "Do you know who lives here?" I asked casually, gesturing to the house that had drawn me across miles of doubt. "Oh yes," the neighbor answered, lowering her watering can. "That is the young school teacher's home, Mary Whitfield, a fine girl. Such a pity, though, with all she has on her shoulders. She is expecting a baby soon. Her fiancé comes to visit every Thursday, you see. They say he works in another town and must settle things with his ex-wife before they can marry." Her words struck like thunder in clear skies. My ears roared, though her voice remained gentle. Expecting a baby, a fiancé who came every Thursday, an ex-wife who stood in the way of their new life. I realized with horrifying clarity that I was the ex-wife she spoke of. The title had already been assigned to me in whispers I had never heard, in a narrative written without my consent. While I folded laundry, baked bread, and helped with school projects, another woman was being promised my husband's future. Another woman carried his child. I thanked the neighbor quickly, though my voice shook, and walked away with careful steps, my spine stiff though my insides crumbled. I found a quiet bench near the corner and sat there, gripping the fabric of my skirt until my knuckles whitened. The image of Mary Whitfield rose in my mind, though I had never seen her. A young teacher, admired, carrying Richard's child. I wondered if she knew about me, if she believed his stories about a marriage already broken, a wife soon to be left behind, or perhaps she did not care. Perhaps she trusted him the way I once had, blind to the shadows. By the time I returned home that evening, I was no longer the same woman who had boarded the bus that morning. I moved through the house on trembling legs, preparing supper as if nothing had changed. Daniel told me about a new book he had borrowed from the library. Claire showed me a picture she had drawn of our family. I smiled, nodded, and praised them, but inside I was hollow. That night, Richard returned later than usual. He smelled faintly of the cologne he only wore on trips, his tie loosened, his smile easy. "Busy day," he muttered, pouring himself a drink. I studied him carefully, every movement, every word. He sat at the table as if nothing had shifted, while I sat across from him, carrying the weight of secrets he thought remained buried. In that moment, I understood that my life was not mine anymore. It was a stage set, carefully arranged to conceal betrayal. My husband had already written me out of his story, casting me in the role of the discarded wife. And if the note I had found inside the Bible was to be believed, he would not hesitate to silence me if I dared to uncover the truth. I lay awake long after he fell asleep, his steady breathing filling the room. My hands traced the sheets, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The mask of a perfect family was shattered. What remained was the terror of a woman who finally saw her place in a cruel design, and the terrifying certainty that if I did nothing, I would be erased completely. Have you ever uncovered a truth that shattered the story you thought you were living? Share it in the comments. Your words may give strength to someone who feels alone tonight. The discovery in Milwaukee gnawed at me every hour of every day. I moved through my routines with steady hands, but a restless mind, replaying the neighbor's words and the image of that well-kept house. Richard's Thursday absences now glowed like signals in the dark. Each time he straightened his tie or checked his watch, I wondered if he was hurrying to Mary Whitfield, to her swelling belly, to a future that erased me as if I had never existed. One memory, however, refused to leave me alone. Months earlier, while cleaning the bathroom, I had seen Richard slip a small brass key into his shaving kit. When I asked about it, he snapped that it belonged to an old drawer at the bank and shoved it out of sight. His tone had been sharp enough to silence me, but now that image burned like a warning. The key became my obsession. For days, I searched whenever Richard left the house early or returned late. I looked through his desk drawers, the pockets of his suits, even the glove compartment of his car. Nothing. Then, one gray afternoon, while reorganizing the wardrobe, I pulled out a worn leather suitcase Richard rarely used. Its weight seemed heavier than an empty case should be. My hands trembled as I unbuckled the straps and pressed against the lining. At the bottom, hidden beneath the false panel, was a small metal safe. My pulse pounded in my ears, the shaving kit key it had to fit. I hurried back to the bathroom, my steps soft against the floorboards, and found the kit tucked behind his cologne. The key was still there, resting as if it had been waiting for me. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. Back in the bedroom, I slid the key into the lock of the safe. With a soft click, the door opened. Inside lay the evidence of a life I was never meant to see. The first item was a pair of train tickets, crisp and new, bound for Buenos Aires, Argentina. They bore the names Richard Hayes and Mary Whitfield. My stomach clenched so hard I had to steady myself against the bed. He was planning to vanish across the world, leaving Daniel, Claire, and me behind without a thought. Beneath the tickets were 2 sets of identification documents, each with photographs of Richard, but with different names. The forged details stared back at me like strangers who shared his face. He was preparing to become someone else, someone free of debts, of family, of promises. Then came the letters, dozens of them, tied with a red ribbon, thick with the scent of perfume that was not mine. The handwriting was delicate, rounded, filled with endearments that twisted my insides. My love, only weeks now until we can begin again. The crib is ready. The neighbors believe I am already married to you. All that remains is for you to finish what you must. As Edward reminds you, if she learns the truth, you know what must be done. Soon we will be the family you always dreamed of. I read those words again and again, each time colder than before. It was not only betrayal, it was a threat, plain and brutal. I was the obstacle. And according to that note, I was disposable. I clutched the letters to my chest, my body shaking. 10 years of marriage, the children we raised together, the countless nights spent sewing until my fingers bled so our family could have more. All of it could be erased with a single ruthless decision. My death had already been discussed, planned even, hidden between declarations of love and promises of a future I would never be part of. The migraine that had once driven me into his office returned, sharp and blinding. But this time the pain was not my enemy, it was my armor. Because in that moment, I knew I could no longer cling to illusions. Richard was not only unfaithful, he was dangerous. I placed everything back with meticulous care, returned the key to the shaving kit, and closed the suitcase as if it had never been touched. When Richard returned home that evening, I greeted him with the same calm smile. I served dinner, listened to his idle chatter, and laughed at the children's stories. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer just a wife deceived. I was a woman living with a predator. That night, as I lay beside him in the dark, I listened to his steady breathing and wondered how many times he had rehearsed the thought of silencing me. Each beat of my heart told me the truth. I could not confront him, not yet. To reveal my knowledge would be to invite disaster. I had to act in silence, to gather my strength in the shadows, to fight with patience rather than impulse. The note had been right about one thing. If I discovered the truth, he knew what he was supposed to do. But I also knew something Richard did not. I was no longer afraid. I was preparing. If you have ever faced a moment when fear turned into strength, share your story in the comments. Someone out there may need your courage tonight. The night I uncovered Richard's secret safe, my world shifted from despair to strategy. Fear alone would not protect Daniel, Claire, or me. If I was to survive, I needed money, evidence, and someone outside Richard's circle who could not be swayed by his influence. My first step was financial freedom. For years, I had squirreled away small amounts from sewing commissions, coins, and folded bills hidden between fabric rolls or inside the lining of my sewing basket. It was not much, but it was mine. yet hidden money was fragile. If Richard discovered it, he could take it with a single word. I needed a bank account of my own, far from his reach. That possibility seemed impossible until one morning, while adjusting the hem of a velvet gown, I confided in Mrs. Martha Ellison. She was a wealthy widow who had hired me many times. Known for her sharp tongue and sharper instincts, she listened as I casually complained that Richard insisted there was no reason for me to have an account of my own. "Nonsense," she declared, setting her teacup down with a decisive clink. "Every woman needs her own resources. I will introduce you to a manager in the city. He is discreet. Consider me your guarantor." The following week, Martha accompanied me to a bank in Minneapolis. Her presence, dignified and commanding, silenced any doubts the staff might have had about a seamstress opening an account. I deposited my hidden earnings, a modest sum by her standards, but to me it was a lifeline. For the first time in years, I walked out of a building knowing I had something Richard could not control. The second step was gathering proof. A mere suspicion or a bundle of love letters would never be enough to protect me. Richard had friends in high places: the sheriff who shared his poker table, the pastor who praised his donations, the judge who once called him a pillar of the community. If I accused him without evidence, I would be dismissed as a jealous wife. Worse, I might provoke him to act on the threat hidden in that note. So I became a quiet thief of truth. I slipped into his office whenever the children were at school and Richard had gone to work. Tucked inside my sewing basket was a small Kodak Instamatic camera I had purchased during one of my fabric trips to the city. Its flash could be disabled, and its size allowed me to hide it among folded cloth. One by one, I photographed documents, false identities, bank ledgers, coded letters between Richard and Edward. Each click of the shutter was a prayer, each roll of film a secret heartbeat. Photographs alone, however, could be dismissed as fabricated. I needed copies of the documents themselves. That was where the local stationery shop came in. Its owner, Mr. Carson, was a kindly man whose sons played marbles with Daniel. I approached him one afternoon, carrying a bundle of papers that included our marriage certificate and the children's birth records. "I want to make a surprise album for Richard," I explained with my warmest smile. "An anniversary gift. Memories preserved." "Could you make copies without him knowing?" Mr. Carson hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "The copier is not meant for private use, Mrs. Hayes, bank rules and all." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Just a few family papers, nothing official. I will sew a new dress for your wife, as a thank you." His resistance crumbled. "All right, but be quick." My heart pounded as I fed the first page into the machine. The whir and hum filled the tiny back room. A sheet slid out, warm and clean. Relief flooded me. One more page, then another. But when I pushed in the most incriminating letter, the one mentioning Buenos Aires and Mary's unborn child, the machine shuddered. The paper jammed halfway, crumpling like a trapped scream. In that exact moment, the bell above the shop door jingled. Footsteps approached. It was Ruth, the new secretary at the bank, a woman with keen eyes who had always watched me with curiosity. "What are you doing back here, Mrs. Hayes?" she asked, stepping into the copy room, her arms full of ledgers. My throat went dry. The machine groaned behind me, the damning letter caught in its gears. If she glimpsed even a word, my secret would shatter. I forced a laugh, pulling out the safe document I had placed on top of the pile. "An album," I said, holding up Daniel's birth certificate. "For our anniversary. I thought Richard would like something sentimental." Ruth tilted her head, suspicious. "Most women would order photographs, not papers." I shrugged lightly, summoning every ounce of calm. "I am a seamstress, not a photographer. Fabric and paper are what I know." She smirked, but her attention shifted to her ledgers. "Well, good luck with your project." She turned and left, the door closing behind her. Only then did I exhale. My hands shook as I freed the jammed letter and smoothed its wrinkled edges. I copied it quickly, slipped the evidence into my sewing basket, and thanked Mr. Carson with a trembling smile. That night, while Richard sat in his study, I sewed by lamplight, the hum of the machine covering the pounding of my heart. Inside my sewing kit lay more than fabric and thread. It held proof of betrayal, deception, and a plan that might end my life. I stitched hems with steady hands, but my soul was no longer the same. I was no longer simply preserving a household. I was preparing for war, a war that must remain invisible until the moment was right. If you believe every woman deserves her own financial security to feel safe, press like so this story can reach more hearts. Inspector Luis Mendoza from Chicago was known in banking circles as incorruptible. Richard spoke of him often, with disdain. "That man pokes his nose into everything," he used to mutter, while loosening his tie after long days. For me, Mendoza was the only figure of hope. Through careful planning, I had slipped copies of the most damning papers into an envelope and sent them anonymously to his office. I prayed the documents would not vanish into some forgotten drawer. The weeks crawled by, each one tightening the rope around my chest. Then came the day of the transfer. It was a bright morning, too clear for what was about to unfold. I prepared breakfast with trembling hands. Richard kissed the children's foreheads longer than usual before leaving for work. His cologne lingered in the kitchen long after the door closed. He believed it was the last time he would see us as his family. By noon, whispers spread through town. Extra police cars were parked near the bank. Clerks said officials from Chicago had arrived with armored vehicles. I sewed at my machine, each stitch a heartbeat, waiting for the inevitable. Then, in the late afternoon, sirens pierced the air. I rushed to the window, my breath caught in my throat. Patrol cars sped down the main road toward the square. The money had arrived, and so had the trap. Richard and Edward were inside the bank office when the officers moved in. Witnesses later said Richard had tried to step out casually, claiming he needed fresh air. But Mendoza himself stopped him at the door, holding the envelope of evidence in his hand. "Not today, Mr. Hayes," he reportedly said, his voice firm enough to silence the entire lobby. By nightfall, the news had reached every corner of Maplewood. My husband and his closest ally had been arrested, caught in the act of attempting to reroute the transfer. The story spread like fire. The next morning, headlines screamed, "The Bible Heist." They called it that because of the note found inside the sacred book, a detail the police leaked to the press. It was the kind of irony journalists loved. A holy text turned into a hiding place for betrayal. But while Richard sat behind bars, my trial began in the streets. Neighbors gathered at corners, whispering. Women I had shared recipes with now fell silent when I passed. Men who once tipped their hats looked at me with suspicion. How could she not know? 10 years of marriage and she was blind? Maybe she was part of it. The cruelest part was not the gossip, but the doubt it tried to plant in me. Had I really been blind? Had I ignored the silences, the Thursdays away, the perfume that was not mine? Each question felt like a thorn. Yet I knew the truth. Richard had built walls of deception, and I had chosen trust. My fault was not complicity, but faith. I spent one night at my sister-in-law Lucille's house, away from the children. They did not need to see me break. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, feeling the weight of every stare waiting for me outside. The next morning, I made a decision. I would not hide. I chose one of my best dresses, a navy blue one with tiny white details I had sewn myself. It was not extravagant, but it carried dignity. I pinned my hair neatly, dabbed on a touch of lipstick, and stepped into the street with my chin lifted. The walk to the market felt like crossing a battlefield. Every step echoed with whispers. At the butcher shop, silence fell as I entered. At the bakery, two women turned their backs, pretending not to see me. Yet I continued, basket in hand, buying bread, milk, and eggs as if nothing had changed. At the fruit stall, Mrs. Whitman, the innkeeper's wife, finally broke the silence. "Good to see you out, Mrs. Hayes," she said with a kind smile. "If you need anything for the children, do not hesitate." Her words steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. I thanked her and moved on. By the time I walked home, I realized something profound. The market trip had been more than an errand. It was a declaration. I would not be erased by scandal, nor defined by my husband's betrayal. The whispers could continue. but I would not bow my head. That evening, as I tucked Daniel and Claire into bed, I looked at their innocent faces and felt a new kind of strength rising in me. Richard might have destroyed the illusion of our family, but he had not destroyed me. The Bible had held a threat meant to silence me. Instead, it became the beginning of my voice. If you believe no woman should have to carry shame for a man's betrayal, press like so this story can reach more people who need to hear it. The days after Richard's arrest blurred together like pages of a book smudged by tears. Maplewood was no longer home. Every step outside felt like walking into a courtroom where the jury was the entire town. I knew I had to leave if Daniel, Claire, and I were to survive not just in body, but in spirit. My salvation came through Lucille, my childhood friend who had settled in Minneapolis. She had always been the kind of woman who asked no unnecessary questions, but extended her hand when you stumbled. When I wrote to her, she replied with a single sentence that carried me through those final days in Maplewood. "Come here, Eleanor. We will make space." The children and I boarded the bus one gray morning, our belongings stuffed into 2 battered suitcases. As the fields gave way to city streets, I pressed my forehead to the window. Every mile between me and Maplewood felt like a thread cutting loose from a past that had nearly strangled me. Lucille welcomed us at the station with open arms and a smile that chased away the chill of autumn. She led us to her modest boarding house where she rented out small rooms to students and young workers. Ours was barely larger than the bed it contained. The children shared a narrow mattress while I claimed a cot near the window. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with strangers whose footsteps echoed at all hours. Yet as I closed the door behind us, I breathed easier than I had in years. The space was small, but it was free of Richard's shadow. I wasted no time searching for work. Minneapolis offered opportunities Maplewood never could. With Lucille's help, I carried my sewing machine into the tiny room and placed it by the window. It became the heart of our survival. I patched coats for neighbors, hemmed skirts for shopgirls, and stitched uniforms for a nearby school. Slowly, word spread of my skill. One evening, a young bride-to-be knocked on my door with trembling hands and asked if I could make her wedding dress. I accepted, though my own heart still ached from the ashes of my marriage. Each night, after Daniel and Claire drifted to sleep, I sat at the machine, the steady rhythm of the needle covering the sound of my silent tears. I cried for the home we had lost, for the life that had been a lie, and for the uncertainty of tomorrow. But when dawn broke, I washed my face, applied a touch of lipstick, and greeted my children with a smile. They needed to see strength, not sorrow. The months passed, and with them came the trial. I traveled back to Maplewood, dressed in my best navy dress, determined to hold my head high. The courtroom buzzed with townsfolk eager to witness the downfall of the man they once praised. Richard sat pale and thinner than I remembered, his hands folded tightly as if trying to hold his world together. Edward, his accomplice, avoided my gaze. The judge read the verdict slowly, each word landing like a stone dropped into deep water. Richard Hayes was sentenced to 9 years in prison for fraud, attempted embezzlement, and conspiracy. Edward received a longer term. The sentence brought no joy, only a hollow ache. He had chosen this path, and yet part of me mourned the man I once believed in. The ruling also declared that our house in Maplewood would be seized to repay damages. I walked away with no property, no savings, but something far more valuable. I had my dignity. My children still looked at me with trust in their eyes. That, I decided, could not be taken by any court. Back in Minneapolis, I poured myself into work. The wedding gown I created for that young bride earned whispers of admiration at the church ceremony. Soon more women arrived, asking for dresses that carried both elegance and resilience, as if they sensed I sewed pieces of my own strength into each seam. At night, when the machine fell silent, I sometimes touched the worn Bible that still rested in my suitcase. The note inside had begun this journey, a curse that turned into a strange kind of salvation. I still cried quietly, but my tears no longer came from fear. They were the release of a woman who had survived fire and was shaping a future from its ashes. Every morning, with the city waking outside our window, I looked at Daniel and Claire and made the same vow. They will never carry their father's shame. They will only know their mother's fight. If you believe in the courage of women who rise from betrayal to build new lives, press like so this story can inspire others to stand tall. Rain silvered the window of our small room the afternoon she knocked. I was pinning lace to a satin bodice, counting stitches to keep my thoughts from drifting, when Daniel opened the door and called for me with a voice I did not recognize. It sounded careful, as if a single wrong word might break something fragile. A young woman stood in the hallway with a baby on her hip. She was soaked through, hair clinging to her cheeks, coat too thin for the sudden cold. Even before she spoke, I knew who she was. Some truths arrive without introduction. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly. "My name is Margaret Olson." The name slipped into the room like a draft. For a heartbeat, I could not move. I had imagined her many times. I had pictured arrogance or indifference. Instead, I saw a girl with red-rimmed eyes, a chapped lower lip, and a child who tucked his face into her neck, as if her bones were the only roof he had. "This is Henry," she added, shifting the baby's weight. "He is 1 year old." Daniel and Claire watched from the doorway, the kind of watchfulness children learn when they sense danger in a room but cannot see the shape of it. I sent them to the kitchen to warm milk and fetch towels. Then I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. "You are shivering." Margaret hesitated, as if crossing a threshold might condemn her. Finally she entered, careful not to drip on the hem of the gown spread across my table. I wrapped a towel around her shoulders and another around Henry. He peered at me with solemn brown eyes that mirrored my son's when he was a baby. In that instant, something inside me loosened and hurt all at once. Here stood the proof of Richard's promises, the proof of his leaving. Yet the child in my arms, when I took him to dry his hair, was innocent of every vow his father had broken. "I did not come to ask for charity," Margaret said once the shaking eased. "I came to ask for work, any kind, cleaning, answering the door, running errands. I was a primary school teacher before all this, and I keep good records. I can learn quickly." Her voice tried for bravery and almost reached it. I poured tea to delay my answer. The kettle hissed like a whispering crowd. Part of me wanted to send her away, to protect the narrow ground I had claimed for myself and the children. But the truer part, the one that remembered how it felt to stand with nowhere to go, could not look past the baby in her arms. "Sit," I said. "Tell me how you came." Words spilled out in a halting stream. After the arrests, the house in Milwaukee had vanished along with the future she had been promised. Her parents had taken her in for a time, then the whispers reached them, and the welcome thinned. She found work where she could, lost it when people discovered her name, slept 3 nights in a boarding room that turned ugly after dark, and left with Henry pressed against her chest and a suitcase that had lost a wheel. "I heard you started a studio," she finished, eyes on her cup. "People say your work is beautiful and your prices are fair. They also say you are not cruel." Cruelty would have been easier. I looked at the lists taped above my desk, fittings, deadlines, measurements. There was always more work than my 2 hands could carry. I needed help. I needed someone to answer the bell when a client arrived, to keep the ledger I scribbled in the margins of old pattern paper, to speak gently when brides cried because a hem felt wrong on a bad day. "You can manage a client book?" I asked. She nodded. "I can write receipts, schedule appointments, and keep inventory. I am tidy. I speak patiently even when people are not." Daniel returned with warm milk for Henry, who accepted the bottle with fierce concentration. Claire laid a small blanket on the floor, and Henry, curious now, slapped his hands on the folded wool and laughed at the sound. The laugh landed directly in the center of my chest. "There is a storage alcove in the back," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. "We can clear space for a mattress and a small crib. You will help with the books and greet clients. The pay will not be much at first, but it will be honest and it will be yours." Margaret's mouth parted. A flush rose to her cheeks. She looked at me as if the world had tilted in a kinder direction. "You would do that for me?" "I am doing it for Henry," I replied, "and for my children." It is better for them to see mercy made real than to hear speeches about forgiveness. We began that very evening. While the children assembled a makeshift cradle from an apple crate and folded sheets, Margaret and I sorted the chaos of my paperwork. She created a ledger with columns so straight they looked like rails. She designed an appointment page for each week and promised to sit by the door during fittings. She arranged thread spools by color and labeled every box that had previously been defined in my mind as the one under the other one near the window. Within a week, the studio felt different. Clients no longer waited in the hallway calling greetings down the stairs. They were welcomed at the door by a young woman with steady hands and a notebook already open. Measurements were recorded without the frantic search for a pencil. Deposits were counted, placed in envelopes, and logged. Margaret listened to women describe their dreams for a dress and somehow translated emotion into neat notes that I could act on later with cloth and chalk. There were awkward hours too. Some days Margaret's gratitude made me ache because it revealed the depth of what she had endured. Some nights I woke to hear Henry crying and waited, suspended between anger and tenderness, before the sound of Margaret's whisper smoothed the dark. Once, in the market, a woman from church saw us together and whispered to a friend with her lips barely moving. I felt the old urge to bow my head. Instead, I kept walking. Margaret kept pace beside me, her jaw set, Henry tugging at my scarf with sticky fingers. The first real test came when a wealthy client, Mrs. Barlow, demanded a rush wedding gown. She swept into the room with the air of a queen and a list of constraints that would have frightened me a year earlier. Margaret guided her to the mirror with a calm that did not crack. She translated Mrs. Barlow's storm of expectations into a plan of fittings and fabric choices, then stood beside me while I pinned the first mock bodice. When the client later praised the smoothness of the process, she addressed the compliment to both of us. Orders multiplied. For the first time, I had to put people on a waiting list. Margaret proposed that we create a simple line of dresses with adaptable details so middle-income clients could still afford something lovely. I watched her talk through pricing and delivery times with a quiet confidence that reminded me of who she might have been if a man's lies had not rerouted her life. Perhaps this work was not only saving me, perhaps it was returning her to herself. One evening, after Henry fell asleep in the apple crate with one shoe still on, Margaret stood at the window and watched the street lamps flicker. "I did not know there was another way to be after what happened," she said without looking at me. "People either turned their faces or stared too long. Here, I am useful. I am not a mistake to be hidden." "You are not a mistake," I said. "You are a person who was promised a bridge and given a river. We are building new planks, that is all." She turned, and we both smiled in the quiet, the way women do when they recognize a piece of themselves in another face. The studio changed shape around that shared recognition. It felt less like a room where one woman struggled to meet impossible deadlines, and more like a small ship, crewed by two hands that knew their tasks. On Saturdays, brides gathered with mothers and sisters, and the air filled with the rustle of taffeta and the nervous laughter that comes when a future suddenly feels real. On weekdays, schoolgirls came for hem repairs, nurses for uniform adjustments, and clerks for blouses that made them stand taller behind counters that tired their feet. Margaret learned how to read the language of fabric under my fingers, and I learned how to trust another voice in my work. We were no longer rivals linked by a man who had broken both our lives. We were colleagues. We were, in the strangest and truest sense, family. The day I realized this was the day our ledger finally showed enough surplus for me to buy a sturdier table and a second-hand dress form. I wrote the receipt with a hand that did not shake and thought of the frightened woman I had been. She had survived long enough to choose something better than fear. That night, we celebrated with a pot of soup and a loaf of bread that rose more beautifully than any I had baked in months. Daniel told a joke that made Claire snort milk through her nose, which sent Henry into a fit of delighted clapping. Margaret laughed so hard she had to lean on the counter. I looked around the cramped kitchen and felt a warmth that did not come from the stove. People in Maplewood had once asked how I could not have known. The better question was how I could have known and still believed that my story ended there. It did not. It was only turning a page. And as the rain eased and the city exhaled, our little studio, born of betrayal and stubborn hope, began to grow in the only direction that mattered: forward. The winter sunlight came pale and clean through the tall windows of our new studio. Silk glowed on dress forms, pins winked in velvet pincushions, and the steady hush of the city outside felt like the sound of breath in a chest learning to relax. We had climbed far from the cramped room where I first placed my machine by a window. Yet the past has a habit of finding open doors. It arrived one afternoon in the shape of a gaunt man who removed his hat as if he were entering a church. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "my name is Edward Barnes." I had not seen him since the trial. Time had carved deep lines around his mouth. He stood as if his bones remembered cells and concrete. Margaret paused behind the counter, her hand still on the ledger. The seamstresses kept working, but the air sharpened. "I will not stay long," he said. "I came to ask for your forgiveness." I gestured toward a chair, though my heart insisted on remaining standing. He sat carefully, as if any quick movement might break what little he had repaired inside himself. "I wrote that note," he said. "Not because I wanted harm. Because Richard asked for something that sounded like caution. I told myself it would never be used. I told myself many things in those years that let me sleep when I should not have. Prison woke me. It does that to a man. I cannot make your life unbroken. I can only say that I am sorry, and that the man who walked into that bank with me is not the man who leaves parole to find honest work." His voice frayed at the edges. I looked for manipulation and found only exhaustion and shame. I could not give what he asked, not then, but I also could not deny the simple truth of his regret. "I hear your apology," I said. "I will keep it where I keep difficult memories, in a place that is safe and not often opened." He lowered his head in acceptance. When he rose to leave, he paused by the gowns and touched the air above a line of hand-stitched pearls. "You turned ashes into something that catches light," he murmured. "I hope to do the same on a smaller scale." He replaced his hat and stepped back into the winter, leaving the studio warmer than when he had entered. For a while after that, the days felt like clean pages. Orders filled our calendar through spring. Daniel prepared for college entrance exams with a seriousness that made me ache with pride. Claire sketched gowns that moved like music. Henry lined up spools of thread by color and announced he was a shopkeeper. We laughed and let him collect buttons as payment. Then a message arrived that pulled a thin wire through my stomach. Richard was out. He had completed his sentence and had returned to the city. He asked to see the children. I called Daniel and Claire to the dinner table that night. Margaret sat opposite me, her hands folded tightly, because she knew her turn would come. "Your father asked to see you," I said. "The choice is yours. No one will push you one way or the other." Daniel's jaw set at once. The boy who had once traced treasure maps in library books had grown into a young man with a compass forged by fire. "I have nothing to say," he replied. "He wrote a story that did not include us. I am writing my own." Claire stared at her sketchbook for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "I will meet him," she said. "Not for him, for me. I need to close a door that keeps opening in my mind." Margaret lifted her chin. "If he asks to see Henry, we set the rules. Visits in public places. Short. No promises made without my consent. He does not get to rewrite the past with gifts." I nodded. Those boundaries were not coldness. They were the walls of a house built on truth. Claire met her father at a quiet cafe 3 blocks from the studio. She took with her the dignity of a young woman who had watched sewing become survival and survival become beauty. When she returned, she spoke little. "He said he was sorry," she told me, placing her hand over mine. "He said prison gave him time to think." I listened. I did not pretend it erased anything. She smiled faintly. I showed him my sketches. He almost cried. I walked home feeling lighter. I think that is all I wanted. Daniel kept his distance and poured himself into studies and part-time work at a hardware store. He laughed with Henry in the evenings, but when the subject shifted toward the man who had left a crater in our lives, He closed the door without slamming it. I did not try to open it for him. We earn our own timing. Margaret arranged a brief meeting in the public garden for Henry. I did not attend. Later, as we washed dishes, she told me in a quiet voice that Henry had shown Richard his favorite toy car and asked if all fathers wore shoes that squeaked. Richard had offered money for school. Margaret had thanked him and declined. "Help is not a bad word," I said. "I know," she answered, "but the cost would be written in small print. I prefer bills that can be counted." Spring folded into early summer. The studio moved into a larger space on a corner where the windows turned sunlight into a blessing. We chose pale walls and brass hooks. The sign above the door read, "Hayes and Olson Atelier." People stepped inside and smiled as if the air itself had been pressed and steamed. I learned to breathe in rooms that once would have frightened me. That was when Richard appeared. The receptionist, who had joined us only weeks before, came to my office door and looked uncertain. "There is a gentleman asking for you," she said. He gave his name as Mr. Hayes. My hands were steady as I straightened the stack of order forms. "Send him in," I said. He entered wearing a suit that had been carefully pressed but could not disguise the years that had gathered in his face. He glanced around as if the walls might judge him. Perhaps they did. They had watched women stand taller through the simple act of being fitted for something that truly belonged to them. "You have done well," he said, almost to the carpet. "We have," I replied. "What do you need, Richard?" He swallowed. "I came to say that I am trying to be different. I know you will not believe me, and I do not blame you. I wanted to see the children." Daniel refused. "Claire met me and was kind in a way I did not earn. I do not know what to ask of you. Perhaps only that you know I wake with regret." I studied the man who had once been the axis of our life. I saw the shadow of charm that had misled so many. I also saw the frailty that follows a fall. "I will not spend my days measuring your remorse," I said. "That is work for your own heart." I stood because the words deserved to be spoken face to face. "There is something I have wanted to tell you, and now I can say it without shaking." He looked up. "The paper you hid in the Bible once read like a death sentence," I said. "For me, it became a birth certificate for a new life." He flinched, and then he nodded, perhaps because there was nothing left for him to claim. He thanked me for seeing him and left the studio as quietly as he had entered. I watched from the window as he turned the corner and vanished into the stream of pedestrians. The street swallowed him the way the past finally does when it has been faced. I stood in the doorway a while longer, feeling the strange stillness that follows a storm. Around me, work continued. Margaret negotiated a deadline with a veiled bride who feared lace could never lie smoothly against her stubborn shoulder. Claire pinned a muslin mock-up with the confidence of a designer who trusts her eye. Henry marched in with a jar of buttons and demanded rent for his shop. Laughter rose and fell like breath. Forgiveness did not bloom that day, not fully, but I recognized something just as valuable. I had reached the other shore. The woman who once trembled beside a locked drawer now signed paychecks and drew clean lines on patterns. The studio smelled of steam and chalk and a future that belonged to us. The past had come knocking and found us at work. By 1980, nearly a decade after the storm of betrayal and the ashes of scandal, the little workshop we once ran from a boarding house room had grown into something that carried its own kind of light. Hayes Olson Atelier was no longer just a name above a shop door. It had become a symbol in Minneapolis, a place where women walked in carrying uncertainty and walked out draped in dignity. Brides wore our gowns in cathedrals, courthouses, and community halls. Daughters returned with their mothers to show them the dresses they had kept folded in cedar chests. Reporters sometimes asked for interviews, calling us the boutique of resilience. What amazed me most was not the fame, but the way the studio breathed as a family. Margaret and I, once linked only by the man who had deceived us, had long since stopped thinking of ourselves as rivals. We became sisters in the truest sense, bound by years of shared work, shared burdens, and shared laughter. Her voice carried authority with clients, her ledgers carried precision, and her laughter carried the sound of survival. The children each found their path. Daniel, steady and serious, earned admission to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I still remember the day the acceptance letter arrived. He unfolded it with shaking hands, then read it aloud in a voice that carried the promise of a new generation. Claire pursued her dream at the School of Fine Arts, her sketches no longer trapped in notebooks, but displayed on walls where professors praised her bold eye for line and color. Henry grew up running through bolts of fabric, playing hide-and-seek between gowns, and sitting on the counter as customers cooed at him. He grew into a cheerful boy who never doubted he belonged because Margaret and I made sure every day that he did. Sometimes I would pause in the middle of a busy afternoon, the air filled with the hiss of steam irons and the murmur of fittings, and let myself marvel. Once, I had been a woman trembling beside a locked safe, clutching a note that threatened my life. Now I was the matriarch of a place where women were not erased, but celebrated. The years moved with a rhythm of their own. Orders, deadlines, fittings, seasons. Margaret's hair turned silver first, and she wore it proudly in a braid that reached down her back. Mine followed, softer and whiter, though I still dabbed on lipstick each morning. We laughed about the way our hands had grown slower, but our eyes had grown sharper. Sometimes we sat in the quiet of the studio after closing, sharing tea and memories, marveling at how life had remade us from broken pieces into something whole. We decided together that the atelier would pass to the next generation. Claire, with her artist's touch, and Henry, with his calm strength, took the lead. Daniel returned often with ideas about efficiency and design, though his career carried him into the world of science. None of them carried the shadows of their father. They carried the resilience of their mothers. On the evening of my 78th birthday, the studio closed early. The children, grown now, gathered with grandchildren who tumbled across the floor in games of chase. Margaret sat beside me, her hand warm on mine, and I thought of how far we had come. I thought of the girl who had boarded a bus with 2 suitcases and 2 frightened children. I thought of the young woman who had knocked on my door with a baby in her arms, asking only for work. Together, we had written a story that none of us could have imagined, one stitch at a time. Later, when the house was quiet and the night pressed soft against the windows, I took out the old Bible from the shelf. Its leather was cracked, its pages thin with age. Between proverbs still lay the slip of paper, brittle now, the ink faded but legible. If she discovers the truth, remove her. I smiled as I read it. Once those words had felt like a death sentence. Now they looked like something entirely different. That note had been the end of the woman who lived in fear, but it had also been the beginning of the woman who lived with purpose. The thing that seemed it would destroy you, I whispered into the stillness, can sometimes be the very thing that saves you. I slipped the paper back into its resting place. It no longer frightened me. It belonged to the past, while I belonged to the future my family had built from courage and persistence. As I turned off the light and let the quiet of the house settle, I thought of the women who might one day hear my story. Women who still sit in kitchens with doubt heavy in their hearts. Women who wonder if the storm they face is the end. To them I would say this: the storm is not the period at the end of your sentence. It is the beginning of your sunrise. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that storms are not endings, but the first light of a new dawn. Every life carries storms, but within those storms often lies the seed of transformation. Eleanor's journey reminds us that betrayal, loss, and fear do not have to be the final chapter. With courage, patience, and the support of unexpected allies, she rebuilt not only her own life, but also created a legacy of dignity and strength that continues to inspire others. Her story is not just about survival, it is about rediscovery. It is about the power of women who refuse to be erased, and about families formed not by convention, but by compassion. Perhaps you have lived through something similar. Perhaps you carry a memory, a scar, or a lesson that shaped the person you are today. If Eleanor's story touched you, let it be an invitation. Tell your own story, no matter how quiet it may seem. When we share our journeys, we remind each other that none of us walks alone, and that even the darkest note hidden in the margins of our lives can become the spark of a brighter tomorrow. If this story moved you, I invite you to support our community here at Grandma's Final Chapter. Like this video, share it with someone who may need hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you will be among the first to hear the next story we tell. Together we can build a circle of voices, each one a reminder that the final chapters of our lives can be written with strength, dignity, and joy.